I want to start by saying welcome to all of you out at Madras, to my friends there, and to my friends out at Northgate. Hey, how you guys doing? We are glad you are here with us today. And if you're joining in online, we're glad you're catching up with us, but I wish you were here. You're missing the best series of the year. In fact, if you're with us for the very first time, I don't think you could have picked a better time to come. It's my favorite time of the year, not just because of the holidays. I love that, but mainly because of this series we do at Community Christian every year called Do Something. Every year we decide that we'll set aside a time at the end of every year and we'll talk about how God feels about the poor in our country and our community and around the world. And not only how God feels, God loves the poor. It's evident when you read the Bible that God has a special place for the poor. God loves them even if they never love Him back. And because that's true about God, that ought to be true about us. So every year we take a little bit of time at the end of the year and we talk about this, and we actually don't just talk about it like people tend to do in our culture. We actually do something, have hands-on projects so we can make a difference. Now, if you were with us all year long, you'd know that we do this 52 weeks out of the year. We have ongoing things that we try to help people in our community. But this time of the year, we just grab the flywheel of compassion and give it a really hard spin to try to keep us going all year long. In addition to talking about how God feels about the poor and how we ought to help the poor and literally do something, we also use this time every year to talk about us, for those of us who have been blessed. Now, that's what we believe, we Christians. We believe that we have been blessed by God with stuff. And we know that there are special responsibilities that come with that. And we know, living in the culture in which we live, the richest culture that the world has ever known, that living in that fishbowl, it has effects on us, and that we need to talk about the effects of living as rich people in a rich culture. And so this year, we're looking at 3 verses written by a guy named Paul. He's writing to a guy he's mentoring named Timothy, and he's telling him what to say to people who live in a rich culture like ours. So for the next few weeks, we're just going to be looking at these 3 verses. Now, I also want you to know that so much of the teaching that we're doing comes right from a book called How to Be Rich by Andy Stanley. He's also a follower of Jesus, and we thought the content was so good, I'd love for you to buy the book, but know that many of you won't, so we're just going to teach it to you. Now, one of the things that we talked about last week, we talked about one of the problems of living in the culture that we live in is that you can go from being not rich to rich and you don't even really know it. That one of the problems in our culture is that because of where we live, you can go from being not rich to rich and not realize you crossed the line. And the problem with that is when you don't realize you crossed the line, you continue to live like a not rich person pursuing what you wish you had instead of learning how to be good at being rich. And of course, the other thing we discovered last week is that so many of us in our culture don't realize that we are rich because we don't know where the line is. We don't really have a standard to determine whether we're rich or not. And what we talked about last week, and if you weren't here, I really hope you'll get that. Go online, listen to it. It's free there. We'd love for you to hear that content. But we learned that, if you make $30,000 or less in our country, you still are richer than some people in our country. You make $70,000 more because rich is a moving target. You think you need to have $150,000 to be rich. But what we learned is when you compare it to other people in our country, we're all rich. And when you take us out of our country and you put us as citizens of the world, then compared to other people in the world, almost all of us would be considered rich by almost all of them. So what we're studying over the next few weeks is how to be good at being rich. And we're looking at these verses written by Paul in a book called 1 Timothy. And he addresses them to people with wealth and tells them how to be good rich people. Now, again, most of us have crossed the line from being from not rich to rich, and for the rest of you, I hope you do, and when you do, I hope you'll be good at it. So I want to read this verse to you. Last week we just read the first phrase. I want to read the whole first verse to you that we're studying together. Here's what Paul says, 1 Timothy 6. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant. Now, again, he says, he knows how you feel sometimes. And you've seen this. You've seen people who are rich and you think to yourself, they're just so arrogant. And the interesting thing about arrogance, in fact, I think this is the problem with arrogance, is you can't see arrogance in the mirror. You can see it in other people, but you can't see it so well in yourself. And so Paul says, hey, Timothy, when you have a chance and you talk to rich people, command them not to be arrogant. You know, it's just that thing that rises up in us. And what he's talking about is that thing that we don't even notice it when it's going on, but it happens as you get more and more stuff. As you get more and more stuff, there's this thing that rises up in you, and it's ugly, and it's arrogant, and you wouldn't choose to have it. But the tendency is that you tend to look down on people who have less than you do. Now, one of the reasons that happens is that stuff and riches, they deceive us. There's a deceptive part about it, and it takes place without us really knowing it. And one of the deceptions that take place is, as you get richer and richer, you begin to think actually that you're smarter. As you get more and more stuff, you tend to think that because I have more and more stuff, I'm more secure, and now I'm smarter than I was before. Now, you know literally that's not true, because you know lots of stupid rich people. In fact, lots of you, just go look at the people you voted against this week and look at their wealth. They're way wealthier than you are, and you know you're smarter than them. That's why you didn't vote for them. If you don't vote, then all you got to do is go watch an episode of TMZ on TV, and you'll see lots of stupid movie stars doing lots of dumb things that you'll just go, how could rich people be so stupid? You just see evidence of it everywhere. But there is this tendency that the more stuff you get, the more income you have, the smarter you think you became. The other things that happens is that as your income goes up, you begin to think that you're more important than you are. Now, you would never say that. But there's this sneaky feeling in you that you tend to look at where people live and what they wear and what they drive, and this ugly thing rises up in you. And if you're not real careful in you, it comes out. And you know everybody's the same in the eyes of God, but in your heart, there's this little ugly thing in you that comes with wealth. And Paul says, hey, let's just address that right up front. When this ugly thing begins to rise up in you and you feel it going on in you, you just need to say, hey, I'm going to squash that. I cannot let God catch any of that arrogant feeling coming in me. See, we have this tendency to think that as the pile of stuff goes up, that's a reflection somehow about us. Now, again, we know that there's a difference between our stuff and us, but we tend to begin to connect what I have and who I am. And you really see this in people when they used to have stuff and they lose it. They now think they're not worth as much. Now, you know there's no connection between what you have and what you are. But if you aren't careful, the more stuff you begin to get, you begin to identify with your stuff. And you begin to think for some reason, because wealth deceives us. And Paul says, listen, don't be confused. You aren't necessarily smarter because you have stuff. You aren't necessarily more important because you're rich. You certainly don't necessarily contribute more to our culture because you're wealthy. So when you begin to feel that way and that thing begins to come up in you and you start on the inside noticing it, you just need to have a conversation with yourself and say, that ain't right. Ed, you're deceiving yourself. People are all the same. And you know this. You're not smarter than, more important than anyone else. And then Paul, he doesn't just leave it right there. He decides that he's going to go on and tell us where that kind of arrogance comes from. Here's what he says next. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain. Literally, the original language gives this idea. Paul is saying, don't put your confidence in. Don't put your hope in. Don't lean your life on your riches. Don't take your life and lean it against your stuff. You cannot put your trust in your stuff. And here's something I bet you've observed, at least in somebody else, is that once wealth begins to have, and all wealth means is when you're rich, it just means you have more than you need. That's all it means. There's a natural tendency in you and me to somehow feel more secure about our future because we have more stuff. There's this natural tendency to feel because I have something that somehow I'm way more secure. I have this sense of security that goes with my stuff. And then you begin to have this sense since I didn't have security when I didn't have stuff, and I have some security now that I have some stuff, I can lean a little bit on my stuff. If I just had more stuff and more stuff, I could put more hope and more confidence, and the more stuff I had, the more secure I'd feel. Solomon, one of the richest guys who ever lived, we just studied the book he wrote, one of the books he wrote called Proverbs in our last series. Here's what Solomon says. He says, "The wealth of the rich is their fortified city." As you begin to gain wealth, you begin to get this sense of security. The poor don't feel that way about stuff at all. People without much stuff, they don't put hope in stuff because they don't have any of it. But it's a natural tendency of people who've been blessed to have some stuff. He says, the wealth of the rich is their fortified city. They imagine it a wall too high to scale. And so Paul just says, again, Paul's saying to Timothy, he's mentoring to pastor a church, he's saying, when you have a chance to talk to rich people, tell them, don't put your identity, don't put your security, don't put your trust in your wealth. If you do, you will never, ever have enough. In fact, do you know how much money you actually need to secure your future? You ever done one of those online calculators where it talks about, how much money do you need to secure your future? Do you know how much money you actually need to secure your future? I know this, even though I haven't done your calculation. The answer is more than you have. No matter where you are in life, when you do one of those calculations about what do you need to be secure for your future, it's more than you have. And there's something about wealth, about having stuff, that the target of rich continues to move, and because it continues to move, we think we don't have enough, so we stack it up, and we stack it up, and we stack it up, and we think if we get enough that one day it'll support me. And again, I'll just say to you, he's talking to people who already trust in Jesus. I think that if I just stack it up and stack it up, that I can put my hope, my trust, my security, and before I know it, it's totally wrapped up in my stuff. And because the stuff can never support us, we think the answer is a bigger and bigger stack. And eventually I'll be secure if I just have a bigger stack. And Paul says to Timothy, look, tell the rich people not to be deceived that way, that it's just futile, that you'll always be going for a bigger stack, that security cannot be found in stuff. I hope everybody joining in gets big stacks. And because we're in a culture where we are, the potential for that is good. But I hope when you get big stacks, you don't put your trust in it. Don't put your hope in that stuff. Here's what he says to do instead. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant or to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God. And I'll just remind you again, this is written by Paul, a follower of Christ, to a guy he's mentoring who's going to be a pastor, and he's telling them, say this to the rich people in your church. This isn't written somewhere to worldly rich people. This is for people who already believe in God, who already trust in Jesus, who are already facing persecution. Paul's just saying, even though you're already believers, though you already have put your trust in God, you need to understand it is still possible for rich believers to begin to transfer their trust from God and leaning their life on God, and they lean their life against their stuff. Paul says, you just can't do that. You cannot lean your life on God and stuff. In fact, Jesus summarizes it this way. He says, no one can serve two masters. You'll either love one and hate the other, he says. No one can serve both God and money. Now, I'll just say to you, if you're a new follower of Christ, you really need to hear this, because if you don't get this, you'll think that something's wrong with you. But the biggest competitor for your devotion to God in our culture, it's your money. I mean, Jesus just says you cannot serve both God and money. Now, we read that and we think, well, maybe you ought to say you can't serve God and the devil. You can't serve both God and sex. Jesus says, no, the number one competitor for devotion in your life is your stuff. You cannot lean your life both on God and on your stuff. You cannot serve two masters. which means to those of us who are rich, which means to those of us who have more than we need, which is what he's saying, we need to figure out how we can blend this into our life. God, I'm leaning my life hard on you. Thank you for the stuff you've given me, but I will not put my hope in the stuff. I'll put my hope, my trust, my life, I will lean my life on the one who gave me my stuff. I won't trust in it. God, I'm going to lean hard on you who has blessed me with more than I need. I'm going to lean on you. Now that's hard to do, and I'll say in our culture it's particularly hard to do. And the truth is, it's really hard, even for those of us who've already said that we want to follow Jesus, it's hard for us to know where we are on this. And again, if you didn't have anything at all, then this wouldn't be a struggle for you. That's why this is addressed to rich people. Rich people, rich Christians. We're always tempted to take our devotion and move it from leaning on God to leaning on stuff. And the more stuff we get, the more the temptation is to lean on God. We lean on what we have been blessed with instead of leaning on the one who's blessed us. That's not how to be rich. That's not how to live your life secure. That's how to live your life with constant insecurity. Because the truth is, we could give you a mic and you could tell your story. You could talk about how there was a time in your life when all the stuff was stacking up and you felt really secure and everything was going really well. And then your kid went off the rails. And you realized there was no amount of resources that you could spend that would get your kid back on the rails. You'd been leaning on this because that fixed everything, and suddenly you realized, I've been putting my trust in the wrong place. So you began to pray that what would really matter would get fixed. Or some of you would tell about a time when you had a stack of money and it was high, or at least pretty high, and everything was going in the right direction. And then a doctor called and he gave you a diagnosis, and you realized that no matter how high your stack was, you couldn't buy a right diagnosis. You couldn't fix that. So you began to lean on God, who could deal with what mattered to you. Or there was a time when things were great financially and then things got shaky in your marriage and you wanted it to be back the way it was, and you still loved him, you still loved her, you wanted it all to be good, and you wanted it all back, but you can't finance that, and you can't control that with money. And suddenly you see it. Your hope's in the wrong place. Paul's just saying to Timothy, hey, warn the rich people. Do you really have to wait until the legs get kicked out from under your life? He's saying to those of us who our kids aren't off the rail, who our marriage is still good, where everything's still fine with our health, can you not decide now, while things are still okay, I will not lean my life on my stuff. Instead, I'll lean my life on the one who has blessed me with everything I have. I will not put my hope in what I have. I'll put my hope in God. In fact, listen to how he closes this. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, not to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. In the end, what Paul tells us that we need to remember is you can't put your hope in your wealth, not for anything that really matters to you in life. You have to put your hope in the source of your wealth, which is God. Now, the struggle for us, again, is that it is really difficult to be really clear on which way are you leaning your life. I mean, I'm rich like most of you. I have a house now that's so big that I have parts of it that nobody ever lives in unless somebody comes to visit. I mean, that poor people don't have that. There are people in this world that don't have a house. I have a house that my cars live in. I mean, I work at a church and you all pay me well, and I tell you how good it is for me. There are weeks that I don't have to come to work and you still pay me. And I know you don't understand this, but it's called vacation. I get paid and I don't have to work. Poor people around the world cannot understand that you get paid and you don't have to work. See, I'm like most of you. I'm rich. And the question that gets cloudy that for all of us who've been blessed with a lot is, where am I leaning my life? Because I don't think anybody gets up in the morning and says, I particularly think no follower of Christ gets up and says, I'm trusting in my stuff today. I'm trusting in my wealth. So the true question is, how do I know whether I'm trusting God or I'm trusting my stuff? And remember, we said last week, this isn't about guilt. This whole part isn't about guilt. Guilt doesn't do anything. In fact, guilt assumes that I think you did something wrong. You didn't do anything wrong. You're in this culture and you're rich. And when you're blessed with a gift that you don't deserve, you don't feel guilty. You feel grateful. We're grateful. We're all grateful people that we've been blessed. But the question is, how do I know who I'm trusting? Well, before we're done, I want to try to at least give you some clues of how you can figure out where you're leaning. I can't promise that I can get you there. You're going to have to think about this some on your own. But I want to ask you to answer a few questions. And this first question is going to take a little bit of some explanation. I want you to honestly think about which of these two statements would cause more tension in your life. One, there is no God. Or two, there is no money in my bank account. Which of those, honestly? I mean, if you're leaning your life on your stuff and you hear, hey, it's been positively proof there is no God, you'd think, well, wow, I'm surprised about that. I had believed that, but, I'm going to be okay because I have this stuff. But if you're leaning your life on God and you find out there is no God, it doesn't help any that you have no stuff. But I'll tell you what, and some of you have been right there. If you lean your life hard on God and you find out there's no money in your account, which some of you have found out, you say, God, we have a problem. I have no money, but at least I still have you. I'm going to be okay. Which of those two would cause more tension in your life? Question number 2. Does fear of not having enough ever get in the way of you being generous? And here's what I mean. When you hear of great projects that are going on that you'd like to contribute to and you think, that's a great thing, I want to give. Like in just a few weeks, I think actually next week, we're going to announce our year-end Do Something projects. And none of that money ever stays in our church. It all goes to great projects to help people here and around the world. You're going to hear that, and a lot of you are going to think, I want to be involved in that. And then when it comes down to you writing the check, if you still use a checkbook, or you get your card, or you go online and you're just about to contribute, do you ever have that sense of, I ought to give a little bit less because what if something happens to me and I need that? I mean, does your sense of generosity ever get pulled back because of what you're trusting in? I mean, that's a question I want you to ask. Does your fear of never having enough ever get in the way of you being generous? Because that's an indication of where you're leaning life. It's a clue about which of these two, God or money, you're leaning on. Because when you're trusting in your Heavenly Father, why would you not be generous? Because He's the one that blessed you in the first place, and He's a blessing, giving, generous kind of God. You're trusting Him to take care of you anyway. In 30 years of doing what I do, I've seen this in so many ways. I've seen people who have lots of stacks of money, and they come and they want to give some money to something that we're doing, and it'll come with so many strings attached. I can remember one particular time where there was a family in our church, and they really tried to make sure that everybody knew that they had lots of stuff, and they came and they wrote a $1,000 check to something. And $1,000 is a lot of money to a lot of people. I know that, but they had already made pretty clear that we ought to know that $1,000 wasn't that much to them. But it had, you got to do this, you got to do this, and call me every other week to tell me how this is happening, and let me go about this. And you just need to know, I wanted to give it back to them because they just had to have so much control over everything that goes. At the same time, in our church, there was a single mom who was raising 2 teenage boys, and I had been in connection group with her, and I knew her a little bit. And I knew she, out of every paycheck, she gave to support what we were doing in this community, trying to help people who were far from God, who didn't like church. She was trying to help us build that. In fact, at one point in our church, she gave more money. This single mom gave more money than any other one person in our church. And every time I'd see a check from her, I'd want to go to her and say, hey, why don't you take this back, because your stack's not that high. But I had heard her, because I had been in group with her, talk about how she trusted in God, and God had always taken care of her, and God was taking care of her and her boys. And I knew she was trusting God to provide for her no matter what. She was generous. You know what I've learned? You know what I've learned about this whole thing? Is that the bigger the stack of money you get, the harder it is for you to be generous, at least percentage-wise. Now, you give away a bigger percentage when you tend to have a little stack over people that have a big stack. There's just something in us that as our money tends to go up, that we tend to want to cut back. I mean, the money itself may be bigger that we give away, but as a percentage of what we have, we tend to want to back that off. And it's not just what I've seen. I'm telling you, you can look at the stats for that all over our country. That's true in our culture in general. That's not how to be rich. That's not how to put your trust in God. And that's how to put your trust in riches that are so uncertain. How hard is it for you to give money that you already have more than enough? Because to have more than you need, you're rich. How hard is it for you to give money and to be generous when you have this question creep up in the back of your mind? But what if something happens to me? What if something happens to my kid? What if something happens? Well, here that what if something happens? That's a really good question. Let's talk about what if something happens. Has money ever been able to determine what happens for you in the future? I mean, who controls what happens in the future? Money or God? Can having enough money suddenly determine what's going to go on in your future? So why would you put your trust in the future in your stuff? One of the ways you know whether you trust in your stuff or you trust in God is, how hard is it for you to give? How hard is it for you to be generous? Third, how hard is it for you to do the right thing if you know it'll hurt you financially? When you know the right thing to do, morally, ethically, and you know that if you do it, that it could cost you financially, how hard is it for you to do the right thing and you have to pay financially? I mean, I've heard stories, and you probably have too. I can tell you stories of people in our church that there were things that they were in a situation at work where they knew there was a right thing to do and something that wasn't quite so right, and they knew they could probably get away with the not so right, but they knew that if they did the right thing, that it would cause reverberation throughout the company, and then it might cost them their job. And they did the right thing. Every time I hear those people's faith inspires me, because I know there's a man, there's a woman who's trusting fully in God and not in their stuff. So who or what do you trust? And is it time that you transferred your trust from your stuff to trusting in the one who's blessed you with the stuff you have? Last week we ended by saying a statement out loud, and I don't think it was too uncomfortable for most of us. We said, God has blessed me with more than I need. I'm rich. I want to add something to that today, but before I do, let's just say that together again. God has blessed me with more than I need. I'm rich. Now here's what we're going to add to it today. God has blessed me with more than I need. I'm rich. But I will not trust in my riches, but in Him who richly provides. Let's say that together. God has blessed me with more than I need. I'm rich. But I will not trust in my riches, but in Him who richly provides. As we get that more and more, as we get that statement deeper and deeper into our life, we will be the people who are rich, and we'll be good at being rich. We will not be those arrogant rich people who put their trust in riches. We'll be people who know that we can put our trust in the one who richly provides, our Father in heaven. And as we do, we'll allow Him to do something in the world about the needs of people in our community, and do something in us to change the way we trust in Him. Now, can I direct your attention for just a minute to the connection card? If you're at one of our campuses, your campus pastor talked to you about this a few minutes ago, and on the back of it every week we have next steps. I'd like to challenge you right now to decide about a next step that you can take. You know, it's a good thing to come and listen, and it's an important part of learning to come and listen. But Jesus says even more important than listening is what you decide to do. So every week we ask you to consider that there might be a next step that you could take. Maybe for you, the next step is that you're just going to continue to come back and you're going to be a part of all the Do Something projects, and you're going to literally be a part of creating some generosity in our community and in our culture and around the world. Maybe this week, your next step is you're just going to say that statement over to yourself that you're not going to trust in your riches, but in Him who richly provides, and you're going to begin to get that statement deep into you. Or maybe there's another next step. On the right side of this card, we have steps like you could begin to take a step of connection, or you could go to Starting Point and you could find out about our church. Maybe you've been around here for a little bit. Or maybe you realize today that you've been putting your trust in riches and that you need to put your trust in Jesus, the one who richly provides for you everything you need. There's a box for you to check on that, and anything you check on the right side of that card, we'll contact you about. Now, if you're visiting with us today, I know it feels weird to fill out any of this, and it's okay with us if you decide not to do that, not to take a next step. And maybe if you just let us know that you were here, we'd like to have a way to contact you. But even if you don't do that, we'd just love to have you come back. Maybe that's your next step, to just decide to come back. We have a gift for you for being here. There's a book out near the Information Center it's a book that talks about the story of God, and I think it'll help you understand where you are in that story and what God's trying to say through the Bible to you, and we'd love for you to take that. And when all the rest of us are folding these and putting them in the offering today, if you're our guest, this is all you need to feel that you should put in the offering. The offering is our time, those of us consider Community Christian Home, to give back. See, I hope you'll just come back and be a part of this series as we all learn together that we've been blessed, we're rich, and we'll learn how to be good rich people. And toward that end, could we say this together one more time? God has blessed me with more than I need. I'm rich. But I will not trust in my riches, but in Him who richly provides. I pray that's true. Let's bow together. Father in heaven, in our culture, this is really difficult. This is about as challenging as it gets for us, is to not lean our life against what you've given to us, but to lean our life on you. And I pray for people that are joining in today that you would do what only you can do, and you would challenge them to think about what they're leaning their life against, and they would make a decision to lean on you. Thank you for your love for us. Thank you for how you've blessed us. Thank you for how you continue to bless us and what you've done for us in Jesus. Thank you for Him now. In His name I pray. Amen.